Ambassador Keltharos stood before the massive viewing screen in his private quarters aboard the Galactic Council station, his four eyes scanning through centuries of human military data with practiced efficiency. The Vrin diplomat had spent the last 3 decades studying human warfare, compiling what he believed would be a definitive presentation on their primitive tactical approaches. His people, the Vrin, had perfected the art of honorable combat. Over 15,000 years of civilization warfare among the Vrin was a ritual, a dance of fleets meeting in open space, warriors fighting warriors. With strict codes governing every engagement, civilians were never touched, sacred grounds were never violated. Surrender was always accepted with dignity. These were the foundations of civilized warfare, principles shared by nearly every species in the Galactic Council. Nearly every species, except one, Keltharos, had initially found humanity's approach to conflict fascinating in its crudeness. They had joined the interstellar community barely 2 centuries ago, bringing with them a bewildering array of contradictory military philosophies. They spoke of honor and restraint while simultaneously documenting thousands of years of horrific conflicts. They created weapons of unimaginable destructive power and then locked them away. Unused, they celebrated warriors in monuments while simultaneously teaching their children that war was a failure of diplomacy. It made no sense to the logical Vrin mind, and Keltharos intended to expose these contradictions to the Council's Military Ethics Committee. Alert chime interrupted his thoughts, 3 sharp tones indicating urgent Council business. Keltharos activated his communicator and listened. As the emergency session was called, the Krell Dominion had declared war on human colonial territories in the Outer Rim. The Krell were aggressive, certainly, but they followed the established protocols of galactic warfare. They had issued formal declarations, specified contested territories, and outlined their terms for honorable surrender. Keltharos felt a flutter of anticipation in his thoracic cavity. This would be the perfect opportunity to observe human military doctrine in actual practice, to see how their confused philosophies translated to real combat. He made his way to the Council observation chamber, where dozens of diplomats from various species were already gathering. The central holographic display showed the contested region, a cluster of 3 human colony worlds on the border of Krell space. The Krell fleet was impressive. Nearly 300 warships arrayed in the traditional battle formation, approaching the human colonies with methodical precision. They outnumbered the human defensive fleet 5 to 1. Observed Takar, a reptilian diplomat from the Saurian Confederacy. The humans should sue for peace immediately, added another voice from the crowd. Keltharos said nothing, watching intently as the human response began to unfold. The first thing that struck him as unusual was the immediate civilian evacuation within hours of the Krell declaration. Human transport ships were streaming away from all 3 colony worlds, carrying millions of civilians to safer systems. The Krell commanders interpreted this as cowardice, their broadcast mocking the human retreat. But Keltharos noticed something the Krell had missed. The evacuations were organized with military precision, following pre-planned routes, escorted by small fast ships rather than capital vessels. The humans weren't panicking. They were executing a prepared strategy. Why do they abandon their territory so readily? Takar asked, confusion evident in his sibilant voice. They prioritize their people over their land, Keltharos murmured, more to himself than an answer. This was unusual. Most species, including the Vrin, would defend their colonies with the colonists in place, trusting in their military forces to protect them during honorable combat. The idea of completely evacuating territory before battle was almost unheard of. What was land without people to defend? What was victory over empty worlds? The Krell pressed their advantage, moving their fleet into orbit around the largest colony world. clearly expecting the human defensive fleet to meet them in traditional engagement, but the human ships didn't form battle lines. Instead, they scattered small groups of human vessels, broke away in different directions, some heading toward asteroid fields, others diving toward the gravity wells of gas giants. The Krell fleet commander demanded an honorable battle, broadcasting challenges on all frequencies. The humans didn't respond with words. They responded with action. But not the kind the Krell expected. A squadron of human ships emerged from behind a moon, fired a devastating barrage at the Krell supply vessels in the rear of the formation, then vanished back into the moon's shadow before the main Krell fleet could respond. Another human group used the debris field from a mining operation as cover, launching precision strikes against Krell communications arrays. Before retreating, the Krell tried to pursue, but their large battle formations were too slow. Two cumbersome Elthers watched with growing fascination as the pattern repeated over the next several days. The humans refused to engage in the set-piece battle the Krell wanted. Instead, they struck from unexpected angles, targeted support infrastructure, and melted away before retaliation could arrive. "This is dishonorable," Takar hissed with disgust. "They fight like scavengers, not warriors." Many in the observation chamber agreed, expressing similar sentiments. But Keltharus couldn't shake a disturbing thought. The human tactics were working. The Krell fleet had superior numbers and firepower, but they couldn't bring either to bear effectively. They were being bled by 1,000 small wounds, their supply lines disrupted, their communications degraded, their crews demoralized by an enemy they could never pin down. Keltharus began accessing human historical military databases, searching for context. What he found disturbed him deeply. Humans had a name for this kind of warfare: asymmetric conflict. They had refined it over millennia of fighting enemies with superior conventional forces. He read accounts of human wars where smaller forces defeated larger ones through unconventional means: guerrilla warfare, insurgency tactics, strategic retreat, and harassment. These weren't the desperate improvisations of a losing side. These were documented, studied, systematized approaches to conflict. Humans taught this in their military academies. But what truly unsettled Keltharus was something else he discovered in the databases. Humans kept detailed records of their defeats. Most species honored their victories and minimized their losses. But humans seemed almost obsessed with studying their failures. They analyzed every war they had lost, extracted lessons, and incorporated those lessons into future doctrine. They learned from being beaten in ways that seemed almost pathological. A species that could lose and learn from it was dangerous. In ways the Krell didn't understand, the Krell viewed warfare as a test of strength and honor, where the superior force would naturally triumph. But humans viewed warfare as a problem to be solved, adapting their approach based on the specific enemy and circumstances. As Keltharus watched the conflict continue to unfold, he realized his presentation to the Military Ethics Committee would need substantial revision. Human warfare wasn't primitive. It was pragmatic in ways that made his carefully structured Rin mind uncomfortable. The Krell had entered this conflict expecting an honorable challenge. Instead, they had stumbled into something they couldn't comprehend: a war where humans wrote their own rules, and that Keltharus was beginning to suspect might be the most dangerous thing about them. 3 weeks into the conflict, Keltharus found himself spending every available moment in the observation chamber, watching the human-Krell war with growing unease. The Krell Dominion had committed even more forces, bringing their fleet strength to nearly 500 warships by every conventional measure. They should have achieved decisive victory within days. Instead, they were losing, not in the traditional sense of fleets destroyed in glorious battle, but in the slow hemorrhage of resources, morale, and strategic position that the Krell commanders clearly didn't understand how to stop. The human fleet had never grown larger than 80 ships. Yet they controlled the tempo of the entire conflict. Althoros watched as a Krell battle group finally cornered a human squadron near the second colony world. The Krell admiral broadcast his triumph, certain he had finally forced the honorable engagement. His people craved. The human ships began to retreat toward the planet's atmosphere. The Krell pursued eagerly. Then the human vessels split in a dozen different directions, each ship taking a different trajectory through the upper atmosphere, using the planet's rotation and gravity to slingshot themselves in unexpected vectors. The Krell ships, larger and less maneuverable, couldn't follow the same paths without risk. By the time they reorganized, the human squadron had regrouped on the far side of the planet and was already accelerating away. The Krell admiral's frustration was broadcast across all channels. Cowards, face us with honor. But the humans still didn't respond to the taunts. They simply continued their pattern. Strike, retreat, regroup, strike again from a different angle. Althoros pulled up more human historical records. Trying to understand the methodology, he found references to ancient Earth conflicts, the Vietnam War, where a technologically inferior force had eventually forced a superpower to withdraw the Afghan resistance, where tribal fighters had outlasted two different empires, the American Revolution, where colonial irregulars had defeated the most powerful military of their era. In each case, the victors hadn't won through superior force. They had won by making the conflict too costly, too frustrating, too lengthy for their enemies to sustain. They had turned warfare into a test of will rather than a test of strength. The concept made Althoros profoundly uncomfortable. Any warfare was elegant and decisive. Two fleets met. The superior force won. Terms were negotiated, and honor was satisfied. But human warfare seemed designed to be neither elegant nor decisive. It was messy, prolonged, and deliberately frustrating. As he dug deeper into human military philosophy, Althoros encountered something that stopped him completely. The Geneva Conventions. At first, he thought these must be agreements between human nations and their enemies, standard terms of engagement. But as he read further, he realized something shocking. These were restrictions humans had placed on themselves, not on their enemies, on themselves. The documents laid out in precise detail what humans were forbidden to do in warfare. They could not attack medical personnel or facilities. They could not torture prisoners. They could not use certain types of weapons, even if those weapons would be militarily effective. They could not deliberately target civilians. They could not use poison or biological agents. They could not deploy chemical weapons. The list went on and on. Page after page of self-imposed limitations. Althoros cross-referenced the weapons mentioned in the prohibitions. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Humans had invented every single banned weapon. They had created nerve agents capable of killing millions. They had developed biological weapons that could wipe out entire populations. They had built incendiary devices that could burn cities to ash. And then, having proven these weapons worked, having demonstrated their devastating effectiveness, humans had agreed among themselves never to use them again. This made no sense. Why would any species deliberately limit their own military capabilities? The Vrin had weapons they considered beneath their honor. Certainly, but those were weapons that didn't work well or that offered no advantage. Humans had banned weapons specifically because they worked too well. Althoros needed answers. He requested a formal meeting with the human military command. Invoking his status as a council observer, to his surprise, the humans agreed immediately. Admiral Sarah Chun met him in a secure conference room aboard the human flagship Indomitable. She was a compact woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen too much combat. Althoros presented his question directly. Admiral, I have reviewed your species' Geneva Conventions and associated military protocols. I do not understand why you would voluntarily restrict your own combat effectiveness. Admiral Chun was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, Ambassador, are you familiar with the concept of mutually assured destruction? Keltharos indicated he was not. The Admiral pulled up a holographic display showing Earth in the mid-20th century, for several decades. My ancestors lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. 2 human nations possessed enough atomic weapons to destroy all life on our planet, dozens of times over. She showed him the mushroom clouds, the devastated cities, the radiation victims. We came within minutes of ending our own species multiple times. Computer errors, miscommunications, individual decisions by stressed officers. Any of these could have triggered a war that would have killed billions. Keltharos stared at the images, trying to process what he was seeing. We learned something during those decades. Chun continued. We learned that some weapons are too effective. We learned that unlimited warfare leads to unlimited destruction. We learned that without rules, without restraints, we would destroy ourselves before any enemy could. She changed the display, showing mushroom clouds being dismantled, weapons being deactivated. So we made agreements, first with our enemies, then among ourselves. We decided that some weapons should never be used, even if using them might win a war. But why? Keltharos asked, genuinely confused. Why not simply win and then show mercy afterward? Admiral Chun's expression hardened, because in total war, there is no afterward. Ambassador, there are only ashes and regret. She pulled up more images. The Holocaust, the killing fields of Cambodia, the Rwandan genocide. These are what happens when humans fight without rules. When we decide that victory justifies any means. When we forget that our enemies are people too. Keltharos studied the images of piled bodies, of mass graves, of haunted survivors. Every rule in the Geneva Conventions exists because we violated it. Chum said quietly, every prohibition is written in blood. We don't ban weapons because they don't work. We ban them because we know exactly how well they work. And we've decided that some prices are too high. Even for victory. The ambassador sat in silence, his 4 eyes moving between the various displays. Finally, he asked, but doesn't this make you weaker? Doesn't this give advantage to enemies who don't follow your rules? Admiral Chun smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Ambassador, watch what happens when the Krell learn that lesson. As if on cue, an alert came through. A Krell commander had ordered an attack on a clearly marked human hospital ship. The vessel had been destroyed with all hands doctors, nurses, and wounded soldier Keltharos expected immediate retaliation. He expected the humans to abandon their precious rules and strike back with overwhelming force. What happened instead would fundamentally change his understanding of human warfare. The destruction of the hospital ship should have been a turning point. The moment when humans abandoned their self-imposed restrictions and unleashed total warfare. Instead, within 6 hours, human rescue teams recovered survivors from a damaged Krell destroyer. Not human survivors, Krell survivors. The humans pulled enemy soldiers from the wreckage, treated their injuries, and transferred them to secure medical facilities. Keltharos watched the rescue operation in stunned silence. They're saving the enemy? Takar asked in disbelief. After the Krell murdered their medical personnel? Admiral Chun's voice came over the observation chamber's speakers, addressing the council directly. The attack on our hospital ship was a war crime under both human and galactic law. The perpetrators will be identified and prosecuted. However, the wounded Krell sailors in the damaged destroyer are not responsible for that decision. They are protected persons under the Geneva Conventions and will be treated accordingly. The Krell fleet command seemed as confused as the council. Observers, they broadcast demands to know what trick the humans were playing, but there was no trick. Human medical teams treated Krell wounded with the same care they gave their own soldiers. They documented the treatment, allowed Krell observers to verify conditions, and prepared for eventual prisoner exchange. Skellthor's returned to his quarters and began compiling a new database, one that focused not on human military tactics, but on human military law. What he found was more disturbing than any weapon. Humans had an entire legal framework dedicated to prosecuting their own soldiers for violations of combat ethics. They called them war crimes trials. He found records of human soldiers imprisoned by their own government for excessive violence. He found officers court-martialed for approving attacks that killed too many civilians. He found documented cases where human commanders had been executed by their own people for atrocities committed during war. This was incomprehensible. Every species had military discipline, certainly, but these prosecutions weren't about maintaining order or preventing insubordination. They were about enforcing moral boundaries during combat. Humans punished their own warriors for being too effective, for killing too many enemies, for winning in the wrong way. Skellthor's created a list of weapons humans had invented and then banned themselves from using. Chemical weapons that could suffocate entire cities, biological agents that could spread plague, incendiary munitions that burned hot enough to melt flesh from bone, fragmenting bullets designed to cause maximum tissue damage, blinding laser weapons, landmines that couldn't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. The list was staggering in its scope. Each weapon had been developed, tested, sometimes even used in combat, and then humans had gathered together and agreed to never use them again. The ambassador found himself particularly fascinated by the category of weapons too cruel for war. The concept itself was paradoxical. War was inherently cruel, designed to kill and destroy. How could any weapon be too cruel for an activity whose entire purpose was controlled violence? Yet humans had decided that some forms of suffering were unacceptable. Even in warfare, a bullet that killed quickly was permitted. A bullet designed to tumble and fragment inside the body, causing maximum pain and injury, was banned. An explosive that destroyed a military target was permitted. An explosive that released burning chemicals designed to stick to human skin and continue burning was banned. The distinction seemed to be about suffering. Humans had decided that while killing enemies might be necessary, maximizing their suffering was not. Death was acceptable. Torture was not, even in warfare. Humans maintained a distinction between killing and cruelty. Skellthor's requested another meeting with Admiral Chun. This time, he brought his compiled evidence and presented it as a formal inquiry. Admiral, I have documented 73 separate categories of weapons your species has banned itself from using. I have found records of 1,700 human soldiers prosecuted by their own governments for war crimes. I have observed your forces rendering medical aid to the same enemy that murdered your hospital ship. He fixed all four eyes on her. Explain to me why this makes any sense. Admiral Chun considered the question carefully. Ambassador, have you ever studied the concept of the warrior's paradox? Skellthor's indicated he had not. Warriors are trained to kill. Chun explained. We're taught to destroy, to overcome resistance, to eliminate threats. But if we train soldiers to be nothing but killing machines, we create something that can't exist in peacetime society. They either become dangerous to their own people or they're destroyed by what they had to do in war. She pulled up images of human soldiers throughout history, so we have to teach two contradictory things simultaneously. We teach people to fight and kill when necessary, and we teach them that there are still lines that must never be crossed, rules that always apply. Ethics that survive even in combat. That sounds like a dangerous weakness. Keltaros observed. Admiral Chun shook her head. It's the opposite. Soldiers who understand why they fight. Who know they're defending something worth preserving. Who believe they're on the side of justice. Those soldiers fight harder and more effectively than mindless killers. She changed the display to show human special forces operations. Our rules don't make us weaker. Ambassador, they make us more precise. When our soldiers know they'll be held accountable for their actions, they think more carefully about every decision. When they know they can't just bomb everything, they develop better intelligence and more accurate weapons. When they know they have to protect civilians, they train harder and fight smarter. Keltaros watched footage of human soldiers in combat. Saw them checking fire when civilians were present. Saw them taking risks to verify targets. Your soldiers died because of these rules, he pointed out. Some of them. Yes, Chun admitted. But the alternative is worse. She showed him historical footage from human wars before. The Geneva Convention cities burned to the ground populations. Massacred soldiers driven mad by the Vey. Atrocities they had committed. This is what happens when there are no rules, she said. This is what humans become when we decide that winning is all that matters. The images were horrific. Piles of bodies, concentration camps, cities reduced to rubble and ash. After World War II, after we saw what we were capable of, we made a choice as a species. Never again. We would have rules, and we would enforce them. And we would hold ourselves accountable when we broke them. Even if it cost you victories? Keltaros asked. Especially then, Chun replied, because a victory built on atrocity isn't a victory at all. It's just the first step toward becoming the very thing we were fighting against. She leaned forward, her expression intense. Ambassador, you asked me why we have these rules. The answer is simple. We have these rules because we know what we're capable of. We've seen humanity at its worst. We've documented it, studied it, taught it to our children so they can never forget. Every rule exists because we violated it, she continued. Every law is a gravestone marking someone who died because we didn't have that protection yet. Every restriction is a promise to the dead that we'll do better. Keltaros was silent for a long moment. Finally, he asked the question that had been bothering him since he started this investigation. Admiral, if you know war is terrible, if you've created all these rules to limit its damage, why do you fight at all? Why not simply avoid conflict entirely? Admiral Chun smiled sadly, because sometimes the alternative to fighting is worse. Sometimes evil has to be opposed. Aggression has to be stopped. Innocents have to be protected. We don't fight because we love war. Ambassador, we fight because we love what war threatens to destroy. She stood up, preparing to end the meeting. Our rules aren't about making war acceptable. They're about making sure that when we have to fight, we don't lose our humanity in the process. They're about ensuring that our methods don't betray our purposes. As Keltaros left the meeting, his mind was churning with implications. Human warfare wasn't about honor or glory or ritual combated. It was about necessary evil constrained by moral framework, and that, he was beginning to realize, made humans far more dangerous than any species that simply reveled in violence, because humans understood that war was terrible and fought anyway. With careful deliberation and profound reluctance, they were warriors who hated war, and there was nothing more terrifying than someone who understood the true cost of violence and was willing to pay it anyway. The war entered its third month, and the Krell Dominion was growing desperate. Their initial force of 500 warships had been reduced to less than 300 through attrition, mechanical failures, and supply line disruptions. They had not lost a single major battle because the humans refused to fight major battles. Instead, the Krell were being slowly strangled by an enemy they could never pin down in their frustration. The Krell leadership made a catastrophic decision. They seized the colony world New Haven, landing ground forces and taking control of the civilian population that had been unable to evacuate within hours. Broadcasts began showing Krell soldiers executing human civilians. 10 prisoners killed for every Krell ship destroyed by human forces, Gotharos. Watched the executions with growing horror. This was beyond anything he had witnessed in modern galactic warfare. The Krell were trying to use terror to force human surrender in the Council observation chamber. The other diplomats reacted with outrage, but also with grim certainty. Now the humans will abandon their restrictions. Takar said, now we'll see what they're truly capable of. But the human response was not what anyone expected. Instead of immediate military retaliation, the human fleet established a complete naval blockade around New Haven. No ships in, no ships out. Then they issued an ultimatum: release the hostages within 72 hours or face the consequences. Krell commander on New Haven laughed at the demand. He executed another 20 prisoners to demonstrate his resolvestors. Noticed something in the human military communications. He was monitoring human special forces. Teams were being deployed, but not for a mass invasion. Instead, small units were infiltrating the planet through a variety of unconventional means. One team rode down with a meteor shower, their pods disguised as natural debris. Another team emerged from the ocean, having traveled underwater for 3 days. A third team had been hiding in the civilian population since before the Krell invasions. Operations unfolded with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Human commandos struck Krell command centers, communications hubs, and ammunition depots. But what struck Kaltharus most was what the humans didn't do. They had numerous opportunities to take shots that would have killed Krell soldiers, but also risked civilian casualties in every case. The human operators held their fire. He watched through surveillance feeds as a human sniper had a Krell officer in his sights. A clear shot that would have eliminated a high-value target, but there was a civilian market visible in the background. And the sniper's rifle had enough power to overpenetrate. Sniper waited 3 hours for a better angle. Even though the officer might move eventually, he got his shot in a location where the backdrop was a concrete wall. 1 Krell officer eliminated. 0 civilian casualties. This pattern repeated across dozens of operations. Humans taking greater risks, waiting for better opportunities, accepting mission failures rather than endanger non-combatants. Kelthors noticed something else. Every human operation was being monitored by what they called Judge Advocate General. Officers, military lawyers before any strike was authorized. These lawyers reviewed the intelligence, verified the targets, and confirmed compliance with human rules of engagement. It was surreal watching lawyers participate in active combat operations. But the humans seemed to consider this normal, even necessary. 1 intercepted communication, particularly stuck with Keltharosa human strike team. Leader requesting permission to attack a Krell ammunition depot that was located near a civilian shelter. The JAG officer denied the request, citing excessive collateral damage risk. The team leader argued that destroying the depot would save human lives in the long run. The lawyer's response was firm. The rules still apply, even now, especially now. The rules still now. Strike was called off. Keltharos began to understand something profound about human warfare. The rules weren't just guidelines to be followed when convenient. They were absolute boundaries that humans enforced even when breaking them would be advantageous, even when their own people were being executed, even when following the rules cost human lives. This wasn't weakness or naivety. This was discipline of a kind the ambassador had never encountered. The Krell, meanwhile, grew more brutal. They began using civilians as human shields, positioning them around military installations. They forced hostages to march in front of their patrols. They broadcast executions. On a daily schedule, the Galactic Council expected the humans to respond with overwhelming force, to finally cast aside their restrictions and do whatever was necessary to win, but the humans didn't abandon their rules. Instead, they found every possible action within them. Human cyber warfare specialists crashed the entire Krell planetary network, leaving their forces blind and unable to coordinate. Human psychological operations teams broadcast messages to Krell soldiers, explaining in detail the war crimes trials they would face. Human intelligence operatives identified every Krell officer involved in the executions, compiling evidence for future prosecution. Human economic specialists coordinated a complete embargo, ensuring that even if the Krell held New Haven, they would receive no supplies or reinforcements. The blockade was absolute, and through it all, human rules of engagement remained in place. Keltharos watched as human soldiers continued to verify targets, continued to minimize collateral damage, continued to treat captured Krell personnel according to Geneva Convention protocols. But he also noticed something changing in the human forces. The faces he saw on surveillance feeds were harder, colder. The voices in intercepted communications were clipped, professional. Drained of emotion, the humans weren't becoming savage or losing control. They were becoming something more frightening. Focused Admiral Chun explained it during one of their regular briefings. Anger makes soldiers sloppy, she said. Revenge makes them unpredictable. Rage makes them vulnerable. She pulled up tactical displays showing human operations. So we train our people to channel those emotions into precision. Every Krell war criminal we identify is one more person who will face justice. Every civilian we save is a victory that matters. Every rule we follow is a reminder of why we're fighting. But don't you want revenge? Keltharos asked. Don't your soldiers want to make the Krell pay for what they've done? Chen's expression was cold steel. Oh, Ambassador, we absolutely want revenge. We want it with every fiber of our being. She leaned forward. But we've learned that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Revenge is satisfying in the moment and hollow afterward. Justice is harder, slower, and actually changes things. The rescue operation for New Haven was launched on day 68 of the occupation. Keltharos was given access to observe the assault in real time. 12,000 human special forces operators hit the planet simultaneously from 100 different vectors. The operation was called Liberation, not invasion. The distinction seemed meaningful to the human. Keltharos watched as human soldiers fought building by building, room by room, always checking for civilians, always verifying targets. He saw human medics treating Krell wounded even while the battle raged. He saw human commanders calling off artillery strikes that would have been militarily effective but risked civilian casualties. He saw human soldiers die because they hesitated when they encountered enemy combatants mixed with civilian populations. The humans paid for New Haven in blood, their own blood, because they refused to pay the cost in innocent lives. And through it all, the military lawyers were there, documenting everything, ensuring compliance with human rules of war when Krell forces tried to execute hostages as human troops approached. Special operations teams intervened with stunning precision when Krell commanders attempted to destroy infrastructure that civilians needed. Human engineers neutralized the demolitions when Krell soldiers attempted to blend into civilian populations. Human intelligence identified them without mass detentions. The liberation took 3 weeks of brutal urban warfare. By the end, New Haven was free. The Krell occupation forces were captured, and the civilian casualties were far lower than any model had predicted, lower than they would have been if humans had simply bombed everything. Keltharos realized something that made his blood run cold. Humans fought harder because of their restrictions, Not despite them. The rules didn't weaken them. The rules focused them. Every limitation forced humans to be smarter, more precise, more creative. Every restriction channeled their violence into more effective forms, and most terrifying of all, humans have been fighting this way for long. Enough that they were very, very good at it. The Krell had unleashed maximum brutality, expecting it would break human resolve instead. They had encountered something far more dangerous than human rage. They had encountered human discipline. The Krell leadership, faced with complete strategic collapse, made one final desperate gamble. Intelligence intercepts revealed they had positioned a biological weapon on New Haven during their occupation, hidden deep in the planetary infrastructure. If they couldn't hold the world, they would render it uninhabitable. The device was designed to release a plague that would kill every mammalian life form on the planet within weeks. 3 million human colonists would die. Along with most of the native ecosystem, the Krell transmitted their ultimatum: withdraw all human forces from contested space, or they would activate the weapon. Kelthoros expected fury from the human command instead. He saw something more frightening. Absolute calm, Admiral. Chun convened her senior staff and made a simple statement: find it, stop it, but bring them in, not destroy the enemy, not make them pay, just the mission. Stated with cold precision, human intelligence assets on New Haven, both covert operatives and liberated civilians, began an exhaustive search. Structural engineers analyzed the occupation-era construction. Project's epidemiologists modeled where a bioweapon would need to be positioned for maximum effect. Security experts tracked Krell personnel movements to identify who had access to the necessary locations. The search took 48 hours. During that time, human military forces maintained the blockade, prepared contingency evacuations, and positioned medical resources. They also did something that baffled Kelthoros. They prepared prisoner transport ships. When asked about this, Admiral Chun explained, when we capture the Krell leadership, they'll need to be held in appropriate facilities pending trial. You're planning to take them alive? Kelthoros asked in disbelief. Of course. Chun replied, they need to stand trial for their crimes. Justice can't be served on corpses. The bioweapon was found in a water treatment facility, exactly where the models predicted. A human special operations team infiltrated the facility, neutralized the Krell guards, and began the delicate process of disarming the Devisa. Kelthoros watched through their helmet cameras as the team worked. The weapon was booby-trapped, designed to activate if tampered with incorrectly. One wrong move could kill millions. The human technicians worked with steady hands and complete focus. No grandstanding, no dramatic speeches, just professionals doing an impossible job because it needed to be done after 7 hours of painstaking work. The weapon was disarmed. The plague that would have devastated New Haven was secured in containment vessels for analysis and eventual destruction. And the human teams' first action afterward was to call in medical personnel to check on the Krell guards they had stunned, ensuring they hadn't been injured during the takedown. The final operation began 18 hours later. Human forces launched a coordinated strike on Krell command facilities across 3 systems simultaneously. Goal was not destruction but capture. Records Arash watched as human teams bypassed opportunities to kill Krell commanders, instead using non-lethal weapons to incapacitate them. Stun rounds instead of armor-piercing bullets, knockout gas instead of fragmentation, grenades, nets, and restraints instead of kill strikes. It was harder, riskier, and cost human lives. But when the operation concluded, 63 high-ranking Krell officers were in custody, alive and unharmed. The human priority had been justice over vengeance. Even when vengeance would have been so much easier, the Krell military command, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered en masse within 3 days. The war was over. happened next shocked every species in the Galactic Council within hours of the surrender. Human medical ships were en route to Krull territory. Human engineering corps began organizing relief efforts for displaced Krull civilians. Human agricultural specialists shared food supplies to prevent famine in Krull regions where supply chains had collapsed. The humans immediately began humanitarian operations for the enemy that had executed their people, used biological weapons, and committed countless war crimes. Why? Keltharos asked Admiral Chun. After everything they did to you, why help them? Chun looked tired, older than when the war had started. Because Krull civilians didn't start this war, she said. Because children shouldn't starve for the crimes of their leaders. Because peace doesn't begin with vengeance. The War Crimes Tribunal was established in neutral space under Galactic Council oversight. Krull officers were charged with crimes against sapient life, but 3 human officers were also charged with rules of engagement violations. Kelthos attended the trial of Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a human special forces operator accused of using excessive force during the liberation of New Haven. Evidence showed Webb had fired on a Krull position that included civilian hostages after receiving intelligence that the hostages were already dead. The intelligence had been incorrect. 2 civilians had survived and been wounded in Webb's assault. The human military prosecution argued that Webb had failed to verify the intelligence adequately before engaging. Webb was found guilty and sentenced to military prison. Keltharos approached Admiral Chun after the verdict. You imprisoned your own soldier for trying to save lives, he said. He thought the hostages were already dead. He was wrong. Chun replied simply, and 2 people were wounded because he didn't verify thoroughly enough. The rules don't have exceptions for good intentions. Ambassador, that's what makes them rules. She looked at him steadily. If we excuse violations when we think we had good reasons, the rules become meaningless. And if the rules are meaningless, we become something we can't live with. The time came for Keltharos to present his findings to the Galactic Council Military Ethics Committee. His original presentation had been titled, Primitive Human Military Doctrine, a Study in Tactical Inefficiency. His new presentation was titled, Human Rules of War, Understanding Restraint as Strength. He stood before the assembled diplomats and began, I came to this investigation believing that human military ethics were a weakness, a naive application of peacetime morality to warfare. I was wrong. He displayed the data he had compiled. Human tactical effectiveness, casualty ratios, strategic outcomes. Human rules of war are not weaknesses. They are weapons. The chamber erupted in confused murmuring. Kelthers continued. Humans have fought more wars in their recorded history than most species in the Council combined. They have developed thousands of different weapons. They have refined warfare into a science. He showed footage of human operations during the Krull conflict. And then, at the height of their military power, they imposed restrictions on themselves. Not because those restrictions made them weaker, but because they understood that unlimited warfare would destroy them. The displays changed to show human war crimes trials. Humans prosecute their own soldiers for violations. They treat enemy wounded. They protect civilian populations, even when doing so costs them tactical advantages. They maintain rules of engagement, even when their enemies do not. Keltharos pulled up the statistics he had compiled, and the result is that human forces are more effective, more precise, and more resilient than any comparable military in the Council. They win not despite their restrictions, but because of them. He changed the display one final time, showing Admiral Chun's words. I asked a human admiral why they maintain these rules. She told me, we don't have these rules because we're better than you. We have them because we know exactly how much worse we can be. The chamber fell silent. Humans are the only species I've encountered who systematically study their own atrocities. Keltharos continued. Every human child learns about their species' genocides, their war crimes, their moral failures. They don't celebrate their warriors unconditionally. They mourn the necessity of war itself. He displayed images from human history, concentration camps, atomic bombings, civilian massacres. These are not forgotten shamans hidden from public view. These are required education. Human children are taught in detail about the worst things their species has done. And every rule in the Geneva Conventions exists because humans violated it. Every law is a gravestone. Every restriction is a promise to the dead that it won't happen again. Takar spoke up from the assembly, but Ambassador, doesn't teaching their children about these horrors traumatize them? Why not simply move past these dark chapters? Keltharos had anticipated this question, because humans understand something we do not. They understand that forgetting their capacity for evil makes that evil more likely to return. They remember not to punish themselves, but to prevent repetition. He pulled up the final piece of his presentation. In a galaxy of species that honor their warriors and celebrate their victories, humanity mourns its wars and memorializes its failures. They build monuments not to conquest, but to the cost of conquest. They teach their children not that war is glorious, but that it is terrible and sometimes necessary. And that difference, Keltharos concluded, may be what saves us all. The Galactic Council adopted human-style military ethics, frameworks within the year, rules of engagement protocols, based on Geneva Conventions, became standard war crimes tribunals with jurisdiction over all sides became. Mandatory protection of civilians became enforceable. Keltharos was appointed to chair the new Military Ethics Commission, but he kept something in his private quarters. A reminder of what he had learned at it was a holographic image from a human war memorial. A simple inscription in several human languages, lest we forget.